I've lived in the same crumbling apartment building for what feels like forever. Every hallway reeks of stale cigarette smoke, and no matter how much I clean, the mold always finds its way back into the corners of my unit. The elevator breaks down more often than it works, forcing the few of us who still live here to take the stairs, which are locked and always filthy. It's a place that feels forgotten by the city, much like the people inside it. But for me, it's home, if you can call it that. I don't have much of a choice. Working irregular shifts leaves me with little time or energy to think about moving, and even if I did, where would I go? Most of the time, I don't even know who my neighbors are. People come and go, some of them drug addicts who scream and slam their doors in the middle of the night, others just as quiet and lonely as I am. I rarely interact with anyone. I guess I've gotten used to the solitude. But that all changed the day I met Viktor. It was late afternoon, and I had just finished one of my longest shifts in weeks. I was carrying my groceries up to my apartment, exhausted, when I heard someone walking behind me. I glanced over my shoulder and saw him for the first time. Viktor, tall with gray hair that looked almost silver in the dim light of the lobby. His presence filled the space in a way that made me uncomfortable. He had an air about him, something imposing and cold. I didn't know what to make of him. I tried to hurry my pace, but my foot caught on a crack in the floor, and before I knew it, I was falling, groceries spilling out across the floor. I expected to hit the ground hard, but instead, I felt a firm grip on my arm. Viktor had caught me. He pulled me back to my feet like I weighed nothing at all. "Careful," he said in a deep, almost growling voice. His accent was thick, maybe Russian, though I couldn't be sure. I stammered out a thank you, embarrassed, and began to gather my scattered groceries. To my surprise, Viktor knelt down and started helping me. We worked in silence, but the awkwardness of the situation hung heavily in the air. Once the groceries were back in the bags, Viktor stood up and handed them to me without a word. I thanked him again, feeling like I owed him more than just a quick thanks, but he simply nodded and turned away, heading toward the stairs. As he walked away, I couldn't help but notice how quietly he moved for such a large man. It was unsettling in a way I couldn't quite explain. The next time I saw Viktor, it was even stranger. A few days had passed, and I was coming home from another late shift when I noticed him standing outside his apartment, the door wide open. He was holding a hammer, and the walls of his place were covered in plastic sheets, like something out of a crime scene. There were splashes of dark stains near the baseboards that I tried not to think too much about. As I passed by, he looked up at me and called out my name, which I didn't even remember telling him. "I need your schedule," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. I froze, unsure of what he meant. My schedule? Why would he need to know that? I asked him as much, my voice shakier than I'd intended, but Viktor didn't seem to notice or care. "I work during the day. Renovations. Loud," he explained, his voice as cold and direct as ever. "Tell me when you're gone, so I do work then." I didn't know what to say. The way he asked, it wasn't a request. It felt more like an order. And as strange as it was, I found myself nodding, agreeing without even thinking it through. The truth was, I was too nervous to say no. Something about Viktor made me uneasy, like there was something lurking just beneath the surface that I couldn't quite see. But I told myself that he was just being considerate, that he didn't want to disturb me with his renovations. Still, when I looked into his apartment again, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more going on. After that, I started seeing Viktor more often. He would pass me in the hallway, always with that same quiet, imposing presence. Sometimes he would be carrying pieces of wood, long planks or small blocks, though I never saw him actually working on anything. Other times, he would simply nod as we crossed paths, saying nothing but watching me with those dark, unreadable eyes. I tried to keep my distance, but something about him fascinated me. I couldn't help but wonder about his life, why he lived in a place like this, why he had chosen to help me that day in the lobby. He seemed out of place here, too clean, too sharp for a building like ours. I wondered if he had secrets. Maybe he was hiding from something or someone. But then, weren't we all? Despite my curiosity, I never asked him about his life. It was easier not to. Viktor wasn't the kind of person you questioned. He was the kind of person you stayed on the good side of, and I was determined to do just that. So, I gave him my schedule like he'd asked, and for the next few weeks, I hardly heard a sound from his apartment. But every time I passed his door, I could feel him watching. Even when he wasn't there, it felt like his presence lingered, a shadow that stretched down the hallway, wrapping around me and pulling me in. And though I hated to admit it, part of me didn't mind. It was a quiet night, one of the rare ones where the building seemed to settle into an uneasy stillness. The usual noises, the thudding of footsteps in the hallways, the creaking of pipes, and the occasional shouting match from one of the apartments below, had all but faded into the background. I was at home, half asleep on the couch after another long shift, trying to make something quick to eat before collapsing into bed. I don't even remember what I was cooking, just that I was distracted, tired, and careless. The knife slipped, cutting deep into my hand. At first, I didn't even feel it, but when I looked down and saw the blood pooling on the counter, panic set in. It wasn't a small cut. It was bad, worse than I could handle on my own. I grabbed a towel and wrapped it around my hand, but the blood soaked through almost immediately. I stumbled toward the door, thinking I'd go to the hospital, but as soon as I reached for the knob, dizziness hit me like a wave. The room spun, and the next thing I knew, I was slumped on the floor, too weak to get up. I don't know how much time passed before I heard the sound of footsteps approaching my door. It was so faint at first that I thought I was imagining it. But then there was a knock, firm, deliberate, and unmistakably real. Before I could say anything, the door opened, and Viktor was standing there. He didn't ask permission to come in. He just did, like he knew I needed help before I even realized it myself. "Let me see," he said, his voice as calm as ever, though there was something in his eyes I hadn't seen before, something almost like concern. I could barely move, my head swimming from the blood loss, but Viktor moved with a kind of efficiency that made me feel like I was in capable hands. He knelt down beside me, pulling the towel away from my hand with surprising gentleness. The bleeding hadn't stopped. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I watched Viktor work. He didn't panic, didn't rush. Instead, he pulled a small first aid kit from somewhere, I don't even know where it came from, and began cleaning the wound with such precision that it didn't hurt nearly as much as I expected it to. His hands were steady, confident, like he'd done this 1,000 times before. But Viktor wasn't a doctor. How did he know what to do? "Stay still," he murmured, though I didn't need to be told. I could hardly move if I wanted to. I could feel my consciousness slipping in and out, the edges of my vision darkening. But I watched him work, fascinated and terrified at the same time. Who was this man? Why did he know exactly how to help me, like he'd been waiting for something like this to happen? When he was satisfied that the bleeding had slowed, Viktor stood up and took out his phone. "I know someone who can help," he said, more to himself than to me, and dialed a number I didn't recognize. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but within minutes there was another knock at the door. Viktor opened it to reveal a man I had never seen before, and yet something about him felt wrong. His name was Dr. Grayson, Viktor explained, but he looked like he had walked straight out of a history book. Dr. Grayson was tall and gaunt, his clothes strangely old-fashioned, as if he belonged in the 19th century rather than the present day. His face was pale and severe, framed by neatly combed hair that seemed too perfect. There was something unsettling about him, but I was in no position to argue. He stepped into my apartment, carrying a leather medical bag, and without a word of introduction, he began examining my hand. The doctor's hands moved with an eerie precision, much like Viktor's, as though they had both been trained for this moment. He pulled out modern tools, sterile bandages, antiseptics, things that didn't fit with the image his appearance projected. It was surreal, watching this figure from another time treat me with methods that were both advanced and archaic. His expression never changed, never softened. He worked quickly, bandaging my hand with practiced ease, while Viktor stood nearby, watching silently. I should have been scared. I should have questioned why a stranger like Viktor would have access to a doctor like this, a doctor who didn't belong to this world. But the pain and the shock of it all dulled my thoughts, and I was too exhausted to ask the questions that should have been racing through my mind. When Dr. Grayson was finished, he gave me a curt nod and left without a word. Viktor didn't seem surprised by his behavior. If anything, it seemed routine, like this was something they had done many times before. "Rest," Viktor said, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "You'll be fine." I wanted to ask him why he cared. I wanted to know why he had helped me, why he had brought that strange doctor to my door in the middle of the night. But I was too tired. My hand throbbed, but the bleeding had stopped, and I could feel sleep pulling at me, heavy and irresistible. Viktor stayed for a few minutes longer, watching me with those unreadable eyes. Then, without another word, he left, closing the door behind him with a quiet click. I lay there on the couch for what felt like hours, drifting in and out of consciousness, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Nothing about the night made sense. Viktor's sudden appearance, the strange doctor, the way they both knew exactly what to do, like this was some kind of routine. And yet, I felt safe. As strange as it was, as unsettling as Viktor had always been, I couldn't deny that he had saved me. In the days that followed, Viktor continued to check in on me, but he never mentioned that night again. It was as if it had never happened. He brought me food a few times, simple meals that I didn't have the energy to refuse, and once he even carved another small wooden dog for me. I didn't ask why. I didn't ask about the doctor or how Viktor knew what to do. I let it all fade into the background, convincing myself that it didn't matter. But deep down, I knew there was something more to Viktor than I could understand. Something dark, something dangerous. And though I tried to push it out of my mind, the memory of his hands, so calm and capable as they cleaned my wound, stayed with me. It was a kindness, yes, but it was also something else. A glimpse into a world I wasn't sure I wanted to see. It had been a couple of weeks since the incident with my hand, and things had mostly returned to normal. Well, as normal as things could be when you lived next door to someone like Viktor. He kept to himself more than usual, and though I still felt the weight of his presence in the building, we barely spoke beyond the occasional nod in passing. I tried to focus on work and keep my head down, but every time I thought about that night, the calm way he had handled everything, the strange doctor, something gnawed at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Viktor than I wanted to admit. It was late again, and I had just come back from one of my shifts. The building was quiet, more so than usual, which set me on edge. I was halfway to my door when I heard it, something faint, almost like a low groan, coming from Viktor's apartment. At first, I thought it was my imagination, just the old walls creaking or someone's TV muffled through the thin floors. But then I heard it again, this time clearer, sharper, a voice, but not Viktor's. I hesitated in front of my door, keys in hand, wondering if I should just walk away. I wanted to ignore it, to pretend that nothing was wrong. But my curiosity got the better of me. I found myself edging closer to Viktor's apartment, my heart pounding in my chest. The door was closed, but the sounds were unmistakable now. A low, terrified whimper, followed by the heavy thud of something being dragged across the floor. I couldn't help but think of the plastic sheets I'd seen in his apartment before, the dark stains near the baseboards. My stomach churned, but I didn't turn back. Before I could talk myself out of it, I knocked lightly on the door. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time, but still nothing. The sounds had stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in their place. My skin prickled, and for a moment I considered leaving. Maybe this was something I shouldn't be involved in. Maybe I didn't want to know what was happening behind that door, but something in me pushed forward. I reached for the doorknob, half expecting it to be locked, but it wasn't. It turned easily in my hand, and the door creaked open just enough for me to peer inside. What I saw froze me in place. The apartment was dimly lit, with the same plastic sheets covering the floors, only now they were streaked with fresh blood. In the middle of the room stood Viktor, his back to me, holding a man by the throat. The man was struggling weakly, his hands bound behind his back, his face pale and slick with sweat. Blood trickled from a cut on his forehead, and his eyes, wide with fear, met mine for a brief second before darting back to Viktor. Viktor's other hand held a knife, a long, gleaming blade that caught the light in a way that made my stomach turn. He didn't say a word, didn't even acknowledge my presence at first. I should have run, should have called for help, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my breath caught in my throat as I watched the scene unfold in slow, agonizing detail. And then Viktor turned. For a split second, I saw his face, or rather, something that wasn't quite his face. His features twisted, his eyes darkening, his skin pulling tight over sharp, monstrous angles. It was as if his face had momentarily slipped into something else, something inhuman. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I saw it. I knew I saw it. My heart pounded so hard in my chest that I thought I might pass out. Viktor's expression remained eerily calm, even as his features contorted back into their usual shape. He didn't look angry or surprised. If anything, he seemed disappointed. His gaze met mine, and for the first time, I realized just how cold his eyes were. Dark, unreadable, like staring into a void. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made me feel small and insignificant. I wanted to respond, to explain why I was there, but my mouth was dry, and my voice wouldn't come. My mind raced, 1,000 thoughts colliding all at once. What was I seeing? Was Viktor even human? Was this a dream? Some twisted nightmare I couldn't wake up from? But it wasn't a dream. The blood was real, the terror in the man's eyes was real, and the monster standing in front of me, whether Viktor or something else entirely, was real. I knew, in that moment, that whatever I thought I understood about Viktor had been wrong. This wasn't just a strange, reclusive neighbor with a mysterious past. This was something much darker, something I couldn't explain. The man in Viktor's grip let out a soft, desperate whimper, and Viktor's hand tightened around his throat. I saw the muscles in Viktor's arm tense, the knife glinting in the low light. My stomach lurched, and finally, my voice broke free. "Stop," I whispered, though it came out weak and hollow. "Viktor, please, don't." For a moment, the world stood still. Viktor looked at me, his expression unreadable, and then, without a word, he loosened his grip. The man collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, his body trembling. Viktor didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, the knife still in his hand, watching me with those cold, dark eyes. I didn't know what to do. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but somehow I forced myself to move. I backed away slowly, my heart racing, my mind screaming at me to run. Viktor didn't stop me. He didn't say anything at all. He just watched as I backed out of the apartment, pulling the door shut behind me with trembling hands. I stumbled back into my own apartment, slamming the door shut and locking it, my chest heaving with panic. I pressed my back against the door, my hands shaking uncontrollably. What had I just seen? What had Viktor become in that moment? And more importantly, what was I supposed to do now? For the rest of the night, I sat in the dark, my mind racing with possibilities. I should have called the police. I should have told someone, anyone, about what I had seen. But I couldn't. I couldn't bring myself to make that call, to explain what I had witnessed. Who would believe me? Who would believe that my quiet, reclusive neighbor had turned into something monstrous? The next day, I didn't see Viktor. He didn't come by, didn't knock on my door. But I knew he was still there. I could feel him, just on the other side of the wall, waiting. And I knew, deep down, that whatever bond had formed between us was no longer something I could walk away from. I was trapped. I didn't sleep that night. How could I, after what I had seen? The moment Viktor's face twisted into something inhuman played over and over again in my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it, the shift in his features, the cold, calculating expression as he held that man's life in his hands. I could hear the soft whimper of the man begging for mercy, feel the terror that had gripped me as I stood frozen in that doorway. And yet, despite the horror of it all, a part of me couldn't stop thinking about the look Viktor gave me, the way he let the man go when I asked him to stop. I didn't leave my apartment for 2 days. I didn't eat much, didn't sleep. I just sat there, trying to make sense of it all. What was Viktor? Was he even human? I didn't have answers, and the more I thought about it, the more confused I became. But one thing was clear: Viktor had saved me. Twice now. Once when I cut my hand, and once when he could have easily killed me, but chose not to. He had let me live, just like he had let that man live. Why? The more I thought about it, the less afraid I felt. Maybe I should have been terrified, but I wasn't. Instead, I was curious. What made Viktor spare me? What was his real nature? I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than I understood. And despite the danger, despite everything I had seen, I wanted to understand. More than that, I needed to. On the 3rd day, there was a knock at my door. My heart skipped a beat, and I knew it was him. I stood there, frozen, my hand hovering over the knob for what felt like an eternity. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to pretend I wasn't home, but I knew I couldn't do that forever. Eventually, I opened the door, my breath catching in my throat as I saw Viktor standing there, his expression as calm and unreadable as ever. He didn't say anything at first, just held out a small plate of food, some kind of soup, steaming and fragrant. I stared at it for a moment, too stunned to respond, but eventually I took it from him, my hands shaking slightly. Viktor nodded once, then turned to leave, but before he could step away, I found myself speaking. Why? My voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper, but it stopped him in his tracks. He turned back to face me, his eyes dark and empty, as though he were waiting for me to say more. Why did you? Let me see that. Why didn't you stop me? Viktor's gaze lingered on mine for a long moment, and for the first time, I thought I saw something flicker in his expression. Something like regret, or maybe sadness. You were already involved, he said, his voice low and steady. Better to understand than to live in fear. The words hit me harder than I expected. He wasn't wrong. Ever since I'd met Viktor, ever since he'd first caught me on the stairs, and later saved me from bleeding out in my apartment, I'd been involved. There was no going back now. No pretending that things were normal, that Viktor was just a neighbor with strange habits. I had seen too much, and there was no way to unsee it. I don't understand, I admitted, my voice trembling slightly. What are you, Viktor? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he just watched me with those cold, dark eyes, as if weighing whether I was ready to hear the truth. Then, with a soft sigh, he spoke. Not something you'd easily accept, he said quietly. I'm many things, some of them human. It wasn't much of an answer, but somehow it was enough. I didn't press him further. I didn't need to. Whatever Viktor was, whatever his true nature, I knew that it didn't matter. Not really. What mattered was that, for whatever reason, he had chosen to protect me. I didn't fully understand it, but I was starting to accept it. Over the next few days, I tried to return to some semblance of normalcy, though it wasn't easy. Viktor's presence weighed heavily on me, even when I didn't see him. I kept thinking back to that night, the way his face had shifted, the way he had held that knife. But I couldn't bring myself to hate him for it. I couldn't even bring myself to fear him. Not anymore. Instead, I found myself seeking out his company. I would bring him small meals, Nothing fancy, just whatever I had in my fridge, and leave them outside his door. He never invited me in, but every now and then he would leave something in return, a carved wooden figure, a small token of appreciation. It became a strange, silent exchange, one that I couldn't fully explain, but one that felt oddly comforting. There was an unspoken understanding between us now. Viktor never spoke of what I had seen, and I never asked, but the bond between us was undeniable. I knew that he was dangerous, that he wasn't human in the way I was, but I also knew that he wouldn't harm me. I don't know how I knew that, but I did. There was something in the way he looked at me, something that told me I was safe. It didn't make sense. None of this did. But I couldn't deny the strange comfort I felt in Viktor's presence. He was the only person I had, the only person who had ever shown me kindness in this godforsaken building. And despite everything, despite the blood and the fear and the monstrous side of him I had glimpsed, I found myself trusting him. Maybe that's what scared me the most. Not Viktor himself, but the fact that I had come to accept him. I had come to accept that my neighbor was a killer, possibly not even human, and yet I had chosen to stay. I had chosen to maintain this bizarre, one-sided friendship because the alternative, being alone, was too unbearable to face. In the end, I realized that it didn't matter what Viktor was, human, monster, or something in between. He was the closest thing I had to a friend. And in a world as cold and lonely as mine, that was enough. The fear was still there, lurking beneath the surface, but it was overshadowed by something else, something I didn't fully understand but couldn't let go of. I had crossed a line, and there was no going back. I had chosen to stay in Viktor's world, no matter how dark it might be. And somehow, that felt like the only choice I could live with.